It's Judd, it's producer Declan, and we're trying to stick to the theme and the schedule for Thursdays. We're trying to do pecking orders every week. I can't remember if we've been super consistent with this, but we definitely have a backlog of Vikings pecking orders to get to, including this one. You guys ready for my most underrated Vikings players of all time pecking order?
So you're starting in 1961?
I'm going back. I'm not going all the way back to 1961, but I am going back pretty far.
Okay.
Pretty far.
Let's hear it.
So I have 7 of them, and I'll admit, so I don't have any defensive backs, and I don't have any offensive linemen on this list, and there's probably some.
Wow.
But I just, like, as I'm going through defensive backs like Joey Browner and Harrison Smith, I feel like most of the Vikings' decent offensive linemen and defensive backs have been given proper credit. Like Matt Burke has been given proper credit, and Zimmerman has been given proper credit from the 80s, right? Mm-hmm. So think on that, Judd Zulgad, for offensive linemen and secondary guys if I'm missing some.
Okay.
But let's fire it up here. Let's start with number 7 on the list. Theodore Bridgewater. That's right. I think Teddy Bridgewater is one of the most underrated Vikings of all time. He doesn't throw touchdown passes. He only had 14 touchdown passes. But he also has an amazing win-loss record. He led the Vikings to what should have been a great playoff win over the Seahawks in just his second year.
Mm-hmm.
He's one of the more accurate quarterbacks in the NFL. He's a great leader. And I think I'm putting him on this list because so many people underappreciate how good he was and could have been if not for the injury with the Vikings.
He was definitely a polarizing player, right? Because it seemed like there are people to this day, Declan Goff, who produces this very podcast, who absolutely love Teddy and will always love him, and actually is torn whether he would prefer to see the Carolina Panthers beat the Vikings in 2020 because Teddy is the quarterback. But then there's the fantasy football faction, I guess. He didn't throw touchdowns. He didn't do this or that. Underrated is an interesting.
He wins football games.
Underrated is an interesting way to frame it. I definitely could see where there was arguments on both sides that became pretty passionate. And I think they became even more passionate when it was clear that his Vikings career was going to be cut short, because we never did get the definitive answer, which was, okay, after 2015, do you come back in 2016 and take off and earn that second contract? And now, oh my God, the draft pick was a great one.
I just think, listen, I'm not a huge, QB wins guy because I think there's so many things that go into it. But when you have a guy that's accurate, that's a leader, and is 22-12 in 34 NFL starts, I think there's a there. And I think Teddy Bridgewater, even though he's beloved by some, he's underappreciated by many.
He definitely had the personality, it factor that we talked about earlier today on another Purple Daily. He definitely had that it factor that I think we can all agree, no matter how much you might like Kirk Cousins doesn't have that it factor, and it's an intangible, and it's something that is easy to see, but you just can't mandate that you're going to be that guy. Teddy had that.
Yep. All right, number 6, most underrated Vikings players of all time.
Mm-hmm.
Chester Taylor.
Oh, I like it.
So Chester Taylor had a 1,000-yard season as a starter. He was one of the better starting running backs in the NFL in 2006 in terms of 3-down backs. He had the 95-yard touchdown run against Seattle, which is like the last time anything good happened for the Vikings against Seattle.
I was there, yeah.
And that was a long time ago now. But he became the best backup running back in the NFL for 3 years, including 800 yards as a backup in Adrian Peterson's rookie season. Chester also had 3 seasons out of 4 where he caught at least 40 passes, 2 of those as a backup. He was great on third down. Yep. He could pass protect. And I think him as kind of a guide to Adrian Peterson, and also coming in on third down and allowing Adrian Peterson to get his feet wet on the downs that he was most comfortable with, I think Chester Taylor's presence allowed Adrian Peterson to shine more because he didn't have to worry about third down dirty work early in his career. So Chester,
and he couldn't do it, right? Peterson couldn't do it. Like he was lost.
Still can't.
The Chester Taylor, the interesting thing about Chester was Chester started his career in Baltimore behind Jamal Lewis. And Chester was actually there on the day that Jamal Lewis set the single game rushing yardage record, which Peterson broke in his rookie year in 2007. And Chester Taylor signed here in 2006, right? And he was finally going to get his big break, and he was good. But I'll never forget Chester on cleanout day after the 2006 season got done being like, I'm dead. I'm so tired. And he wanted that role, but he got it and realized that you just get abused and used in every way possible. And so the interesting thing was, and I might be wrong here, but I never sensed that he resented the pick of Peterson, because he could sort of go back to the role of, I'm still important, but I'm not out there on every down, which
And
he
he
could
made
do.
starting running back money. He made starting running back money.
Exactly. But that's a great one because the Vikings post Chester never truly replaced him in my mind with that guy who could basically go out there on third down and be impactful and be good. That's a great one because he was probably that role that he played behind Peterson, because Peterson was so dynamic, probably never appreciated enough by the fan base until Chester was gone, and it was hard to replace him.
Did he throw a chair at Bryant McKinnie one time?
No,
or was it the other way?
No, he and Erasmus James got in a dispute in the locker room, and McKinney and Chester were like best friends, and they lockered by each other. And so during the course of the dust-up, I guess is a fair term for it, during the course of the dust-up, Chester picked up a chair to throw it at Erasmus James and reared back and hit McKinney in the face and cut him. And fortunately, because Bryant was a pretty passive guy and they were good friends, he didn't kill Chester. But Chester injured McKinney while in some type of verbal and or then physical confrontation with Erasmus James.
Actually, the backstory that no one really knows about is Erasmus James then picked up another chair and threw it, and it hit Tavares Jackson. That's the only time in Erasmus James' career that he hit a quarterback.
Wow, just because Erasmus James doesn't like football. Didn't like football.
All right, number 5 into the top 5 most underrated Vikings of all time. We're going back to the old school here, going back to the mid-1970s.
Right.
John Gilliam, wide receiver John Gilliam, was a star receiver in an era that didn't have many star wide receivers. I mean, you had like Lynn Swann and Fred Biletnikoff and Raymond Berry. Like, there just weren't any star receivers.
Fred Biletnikoff.
John Gilliam, from 1972 through 1975 for the Vikings, averaged 20 yards per catch, including leading the NFL in one of those years, averaging 22 yards per catch. All right. For some context, you're lucky if in today's NFL, one guy averages 20 yards per catch. The Vikings had a guy for 4 years, one of the best deep threats in the NFL, that averaged for Fran Tarkenton. Actually, Fran might have been. I'd have to go look in crossroads, but Fran was there for at least a couple years with John Gilliam.
That was Fran for sure.
And 20 yards per catch is absurd. Wow. So John Gilliam, never saw you play. It was before my time, but
me too.
Got to give.
Didn't see him play. But I mean, yeah, those statistics are awesome. Who's your 4?
All right, number 4, E.J. Henderson. E.J. Henderson, especially before the injury. So if you go and look at like Vikings defensive stats, now in fairness, defensive stats aren't really, it's really like 1980 to the present, because a lot of the stats from before 1980 aren't officials, like tackles and sacks and things like that. So grain of salt that a lot of the Vikings defensive stats are without like some of the best players in franchise history. But E.J. Henderson is top 5 or 10 in a lot of Vikings defensive categories. 67 career tackles for loss, 13 forced fumbles, and at his peak, I think he was one of the best linebackers in the NFL. And then he suffers the gruesome leg injury, pretty much in the middle of his prime, Judd Zolgad. So I've got EJ as a top 5 most underrated Vikings player.
Sunday night game in Arizona in 2009. That is, I think, the most gruesome injury that I have ever seen, because his leg in front of us snapped. It was disgusting. It was a basically in like what happened with Teddy in 2016. That was it's so bad we have to save the guy's leg. But EJ, to his credit, so he came in. I think he was drafted in the Tice years, and he came in. And if you guys recall, he was forced into, if not a starting role, playing a lot at first, and was overmatched, overwhelmed, and was not close to probably being good enough to play as many snaps as he did under Tice. I want to say, was it in 2005 in Tice's last year or so, he was going to, they were going to have him compete for a job, and EJ came to camp and tore it up. He was absolutely fantastic. And yes, from essentially 2005 or 6, I think it was 5, from 2005 to 2009, this guy had turned himself into a really good player. That's a good one, because I think the initial impression of EJ was, okay, this ain't going to work. And he basically said, okay, bleep it, I'll work harder to make it work, and became a really good player.
That image of that leg to the side on that kick
it's
return.
disgusting.
It's one of the most gruesome things of all time, man. It's bad.
That's a bad
Yeah.
one.
Ugh. All right, we're into the top 3 here. Top 3 most underrated Vikings players of all time, and we're going back to that same era as E.J. Henderson. Brian Robeson,
Yes.
a consistently good player for 11 years. 11 years as a Viking. He could rush the passer. He could stop the run. He was a leader. He was humble. Even when he was reduced at some points to backup roles, he was the consummate professional about it. And this is the most amazing stat for Brian Robeson. He's a big guy. He played a rough and tumble trenches position for 11 years. He missed 3 games, boys, in 11 years as a Minnesota Viking. He's sort of the modern day defensive Iron Man for the Brad Childress, Leslie Frazier, and early part of Mike Zimmer's career. So Brian Robeson is third on my list of underrated Vikings players of all time.
Played inside, played outside. He was, and man, you talk about a guy, Vikings wise, who knows where all the bodies are buried, right? B-Rob was here in 2010. He was back here in 2016. That's a good one. And he also came along at a time when I think that left end was still seen more as sort of a base end and not now I think a team's hope or expectation is that guys can rush from the right and left side. At that point in time, your right end, Jared, was going to be your star. Your left end was more of just a solid guy who could help contain the run. That's a good one, though. And I think when he got here, you thought to yourself, okay, this guy is going to have a career probably, but certainly not near the length of what it ended up being for Brian Robeson.
Yep.
So that's 3, right? That's number 3?
No, number 2.
Okay.
Most underrated Vikings players of all time. Jake Reed. And Jake Reed gets credit, but Jake Reed, for a 4-year stretch in the 1990s, was one of the best wide receivers in the NFL. In fact, I just pulled this up for reference. So between 1994 and 1997, only 4 guys in the NFL had more receiving yards than Jake Reed.
Yep.
Chris Carter, Michael Irvin, Tim Brown, and Herman Moore. The guys who were behind Jake Reed in that category included Jerry Rice, Isaac Bruce, and Irving Fryer. And so legitimately from 1994 through 1997, the Vikings had Chris Carter, Hall of Famer, and one of the best wide receivers in the NFL that no one really talked about during that era in Jake Reed. So, and then Randy Moss came. Jake Reed got a little bit older. Jake Reed had some injuries in 1998, and it was just kind of over for him. But I'm putting him number 2 because when we think of great Vikings receivers, I mean, it's Randy Moss, it's Chris Carter,
right?
It's Ahmad Rashad back in the 70s, and then it's probably now like Diggs and Thielen. And oh, wait a second, Jake Reed was ridiculous for 4 years in the 90s.
If Moss does not get drafted by the Vikings, what is the retrospective now on Reed's career here? Because I feel like the whole Moss thing changed everything entirely, and it was 3 deep. Oh yeah, it's 3 deep. It's Randy Moss and it's Chris Carter, and 3 deep. Oh yeah, Jake Reed. Yeah. If Randy Moss gets taken before falling to the Vikings in the 98 draft, how are we talking today about Jake Reed? Because you're probably right. Jake Reed just gets forgotten because it became Moss and CC, and there's another guy, but.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, and that doesn't count for the good question standings, but it is a good question.
Still a good question.
Which, by the way, I lead by 2 good questions this year, just to make sure that everyone knows that. Fair and square. Jake Reed wound up playing another 5 years in the NFL, and he never produced another 1,000-yard season. The thing is, like, he wasn't highly touted coming out of the draft, and he didn't really get a start on his career until he was like 26 or 27 in terms of getting regular playing time. And so by the time Moss came around, Reed was in his early 30s, and so it might have just been over anyways for him.
Right, but I still think we talk about him more now.
Yeah,
Sans
I think
Moss,
that's true.
I think we talk about the 90s from the perspective of, okay, Carter was great, Jake Reed was great, and even if Reed had started the 98 season without Moss there and gotten hurt, I think that the way that we address the Jake Reed topic is different.
I think that's fair. All right, and my number 1 most underrated Vikings player of all time. Before I get to number 1, do you guys have either any guesses or anyone that you feel like should obviously be on this list? And maybe you'll guess correctly.
Well, you didn't list Mo Williams, who would be on my list.
Offense or defense?
I don't think he'd be number 1.
Mo Williams. All right.
Offense or defense?
Defense.
I got to guess.
Okay.
Dex, do you
No,
have a
you go.
guess?
You go.
I think that you are. I don't think that you would be out of bounds to pick Antoine Winfield.
Yeah, I
He's
was.
not on.
thinking
He's
that
not on my list. I feel like Antoine. I feel like people fawned over Antoine properly.
too. Okay.
But
I will.
open to debate.
I'll go Corey Chavis.
Wow.
I like
Wow.
I like you reaching back.
I'm trying.
Way to go, Dex.
I mean, Corey Chavis is maybe underrated, but he's not. He's not number one. He might
Sure.
be an honorable mention.
Sure.
Number one on my list is actually a Pro Football Hall of Famer. He's a 6-time Pro Bowler. He's a 5-time All-Pro, and he had 130 sacks unofficially because
Carl
they didn't
Eller?
actually. Carl Eller.
That's because you dissed him when you were a kid. He's not underrated.
He is.
You rubbed it in that he lost 4 Super Bowls, and now you'd feel bad to this day.
When people and maybe drop a lot, go to our YouTube page, and because there's a lot of younger Vikings fans that
crazy
that are in our comment section. Drop a comment in the comment section. YouTube.com/ScoreNorth. Carl Eller. When you think back to like 70s Purple People Eater Vikings defenses and the whole team, I think he's like 6th on the list of people that pop up in the Alan Page, Jim Marshall, Fran Tarkenton, Chuck Foreman,
I think Eller's up there.
Bud Grant, and like Carl Eller should be probably number 2 on that list. Maybe for sure one of the 3 most mentioned guys. And it took him forever to get into the
Jim
Hall of Fame.
Marshall is still not in the Hall. Carl Eller is. Jim Marshall actually has probably a better case than Carl to be atop of your list.
Maybe. And but you could also make the case. Alan Page. I'll give you some numbers here.
Yep.
And maybe I'm wrong on this. And it's it's up for debate. But so stats for sacks came in like 1980 in the NFL. So when you look at like Pro Football Reference or a list of Viking sack leaders,
right.
Chris Doleman is number 1 with 114 sacks, I believe, because they didn't start counting sacks until after the Purple People Eaters were gone. So only one player since 1980 for the Vikings has over 100 career sacks. Well, Eller has 130. Alan Page has like 170, and those guys just like don't exist
from
on
the interior
on the rankings.
too.
It's ridiculous.
Yes.
Right. So that's my list. Who am I missing? Who would you guys have put on here?
I got to think about it more. I think
Are there any linemen, like offensive linemen, that I'm missing?
There probably are.
John Sullivan. I think John Sullivan's probably near on that list. He was a very good
He was
center.
steady.
Yeah,
he was steady.
Yeah, but what's the proper praise for those positions? Like, I feel that you would have to be just outstanding and ignored. And I feel like in this town, Vikings fans have given proper appreciation to the O-line when it's appropriate, which clearly right now it's probably not. But I love Chester Taylor. Robeson, I agree with, could easily make that list. I think if you're going to put Eller on your list, I think Winfield belongs too. But okay. I can also see a debate to say that both of them actually got the proper love. Jake Reed's perfect because
the problem is I wrote the list in pen, and so I don't know what we're supposed to do. Just, scribble it out.
have you ever heard of whiteout?
I have, yes.
You can take whiteout. You can just put it right over that. But that's an interesting list. Food for thought. I love the reach back into the 70s.
Yeah, I mean, John Gilliam and I.
There's probably Vikings in the 60s who we're not thinking of too, who we all just didn't see play.
Right.
I mean, Joe Kapp. Some people might say Joe Kapp just because he quarterbacked the Super Bowl for the Vikings.
I think he got the love though, didn't he? I think he got the proper appreciation at that time because of that.
Yeah. Bill Brown.
Boom boom. Yeah, maybe.
Boom boom.
Yeah,
maybe.
Boom boom Brown. Yeah. Well, if you want to debate us, you can always hit us up in the comment section on YouTube or tweet or gram us at Phil Mackey, at Jay Zolgad, at Dex's tweets. Judley's got a gram profile.
Use the gram?
That's right. We can use the gram.
I was excited about the gram before the pandemic.
I think you should be documenting your daily journey.
I agree.
Daily selfies.
You and Stella with the Stella, I can see it now.
Had a few last night.
So did I.
Do a daily dog pick with Stella and watch how much traction it gets. I promise.
Seriously?
Yes. Animals all day.
Really?
Send them to Declan and he can put them on Score Note too.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll do a daily with Tommy, our little cat Tommy. If you do a daily with Stella,
bring Tommy in. Come here, Tommy.
That's a wrap on this episode of Purple Daily. Thanks for hanging out with us, and we'll see you next time.